I'm Meredith Holladay, and I wanted to give everybody an update on Sport Pilot 2.0, otherwise known as Mosaic. And I've got some slides here to demonstrate what this is all about and give you all an idea of how Holladay Aviation is going to handle this rule change when it takes effect in mid-October. So what is Sport Pilot? Sport Pilot 1.0 was approved in 2004, so this rule is over 20 years old now. It defined a new type of pilot certificate called the Sport Pilot Certificate, as well as a new classification of aircraft called Light Sport Aircraft, or LSA. Under Sport Pilot 1.0, sport pilots were limited to only acting as PIC in light sport aircraft, and that meant generally 2 seats with a maximum gross weight of 1,320 pounds, so a pretty small lightweight airplane. Sport Pilot 2.0 was approved in 2025, so this was just about a week ago at EAA AirVenture in Oshkosh is when this was announced. It redefines the privileges and limitations of sport pilots who are no longer limited to only flying light sport aircraft. Now, Mosaic, aka Sport Pilot 2.0, also includes a lot of other stuff having to do with the manufacture of light sport aircraft, but I'm not going into that here because, number one, I don't manufacture light sport aircraft and I don't plan on buying a light sport aircraft anytime soon. So this is intended to illustrate how we at Holladay Aviation intend to implement these rules when they take effect and some questions that we have about the rules that have already been published. Under Sport Pilot 2.0, sport pilots can now act as pilot in command in a wider range of aircraft with operational restrictions imposed. So they can fly aircraft with 2 or 4 seats now with no defined maximum gross weight. So it's based on stall speed. So the aircraft that sport pilots now will be able to fly must have a clean stall speed of 59 knots calibrated airspeed or less. Where can you find the regulations and the text having to do with all of this? So I've put up 2 links in the PowerPoint. The first one is to the federal regulations themselves. So this hasn't been updated with the new regs yet because, as I said, they're not going to take effect until mid-October. So I have a feeling that the FAA is busy getting all this stuff together to be published and probably answering a lot of questions like that folks like me are asking about the new regulations before they actually put it online. But there's a link to where you can find these current sport pilot regulations. And the outline of the new regulations is in the Federal Register, and there's a link to that below, as well as a link to the final rule that was published during AirVenture. So what do light sport aircraft look like? Well, we actually own 2 of them here. One is our Cub, the airplane that I love to fly, 656 Charlie Charlie. That's a Cub Crafters Sport Cub, very similar to a J3 Cub, which is grandfathered as a light sport aircraft under the old rules. And you can also see the blue airplane there is a Breeze. So that's a light sport aircraft that's a bit of a different design, more like what you would consider to be an ultralight, but it has 2 seats, a Rotax engine, so it could be used for training if we wanted to use it for training. And we did for a while. We don't anymore, but we still own it and enjoy it. So those are 2 light sport aircraft that we own. Now, for all you folks who think that I'm a light sport aircraft hater, I hope this little clip will prove to you that I certainly am not.
Feel the night, it's burning white, chasing streaks across the sky. Every second starts to steal. What's the point if we don't feel? Live while we're alive, don't stall. Take the leap, we'll risk it all. Fly with fire in our eyes. Live while we're alive, we'll rise. Break the cage, we'll make it shake. Run with wolves for our own sake. Live while we're alive, don't stop. Take the leap, we'll risk it all. Fly with fire in our eyes. Live while we're alive, we'll
EAA is the Experimental Aircraft Association. This was a poster that they displayed at AirVenture this year, and highlighting the benefits of Mosaic. They'll be able to fly a wider range of aircraft, not just light sport aircraft, so something like a Cessna 150 or 152 or 172, possibly even a Cessna 182, and lots of other makes and models of aircraft. So pretty much any 2 or 4 seat aircraft out there that's in the general aviation fleet, most of those will now be accessible to sport pilots. They will have expanded privileges such as night flying with additional training and endorsement. They'll be able to fly complex and retractable gear airplanes, so lots more options, which is a good thing. However, the one problem and flat out falsehood that I noticed in a lot of the marketing for Sport Pilot 2.0 was this half price business. In the regulations, sport pilots only need a minimum of 20 hours of flight time in order to qualify for the certificate, and private pilots need 40. So 20 is half of 40, so that's where the whole half price, half time thing came in. But the reality is far different from that, as you'll see here in a moment. So what are some of the limitations of sport pilots under the new rules? They won't be able to carry more than 1 passenger, even if they're flying a 4-seat airplane. So if you're a sport pilot flying my Cessna 172, you'll be able to do that, but you can only take 1 passenger, even though a private pilot flying the exact same airplane can fill the airplane up with 3 passengers. So that's a bit of a head scratcher, but the FAA has outlined their justification for it in the NPRM and in the final rule, which you can read online. Sport pilots won't be able to fly into Class D, C, or B airspace without an endorsement, but they can if they get an endorsement. These classes of airspace are otherwise fair game to any private pilot without any further training. Sport pilots can't fly at night unless they get training and an endorsement, which is a change. That's a new change to the sport pilot rules. Before, they just flat out couldn't fly at night at all, ever. But now they will be able to fly at night if they get additional training and an endorsement. So for you folks that are thinking about a career in aviation, sport pilot still isn't a good option to start with, because you can't add an instrument rating to a sport pilot certificate the way you can add an instrument rating to a private or a commercial. You have to first, quote, upgrade your sport pilot certificate to a private, which may seem like not a big deal at a high level on paper, but as you'll see here in a few minutes, it actually doesn't work out exactly as you might have intended because of all the additional time and cost involved in doing that, quote, upgrade. So here's an example of an aircraft in our fleet that a sport pilot would be able to fly now, have access to, a Cessna 172. And I've put a couple snapshots from the pilot's operating handbook of the Cessna 172s that we own and operate to illustrate why they're compliant with the new sport pilot rules, and that's because of the stall speed is below that 59 knot limit. Same with the Cessna 150 and 152. They also qualify now to be operated as pilot in command by sport pilots because of the lower stall speed. So why would someone want to seek a sport pilot certificate as opposed to a private pilot certificate? You may not want to, or you can't, obtain a third-class medical out of fear of being denied due to something in your medical history or perhaps a current condition that you have. Now, you should know that the FAA prohibits sport pilots from flying if they know of anything that would prevent them from flying safely anyway. So this kind of opens the gate for a lot more pilots that perhaps have some hesitation about getting a medical and they haven't flown yet because they were only limited to light sport aircraft and they just felt like that was a dead end. Now they can pursue a sport pilot certificate and have access to all these other aircraft without getting a medical. You may seek a sport pilot certificate versus a private if you have no intention of ever pursuing an instrument rating or a commercial. You just want to fly day VFR kind of recreationally, not really go on a whole lot of trips where you might need the instrument rating, so your sport pilot certificate may be good enough. Maybe you never fly with more than one passenger. You don't have any friends or family that want to fly with you. Maybe you're pretty much flying by yourself all the time. In this case, the passenger limitation really doesn't jam you up at all, so you're perfectly happy to accept the limitation of only flying with one passenger. Maybe you rarely fly at night, in which case now you can get additional training and fly at night as a sport pilot, but if you rarely fly at night anyway, then that may not be a limiting factor for you, so sport pilot may be just fine. Maybe you're the kind of person who avoids controlled airspace. I've met a lot of these pilots before. They're kind of scared of controlled airspace. They just as soon go around it. And I think you're kind of missing out on opportunities there, but if that's how you fly, that's fine. And if that's kind of how you roll, then sport pilot may be good enough for you. However, here at Craig, that doesn't exactly work because we are a Class Delta airport, so I'm going to explain again how we will plan on implementing this rule at Holladay Aviation here at Craig Airport. So regarding the medical situation, if you look at the regulation 61.23c, this says a person using a U.S. driver's license to meet the requirements of paragraph C while exercising sport pilot privileges must, and there's a list of things that you have to comply with here. And the last item is not know or have reason to know of any medical condition that would make that person unable to operate a light sport aircraft in a safe manner. So again, if you've been sort of avoiding flying because you think you can't get a medical and sport pilot seemed like the way to go, you really ought not to be doing that if you know of something that's wrong with yourself that would prevent you from flying safely. So the FAA still has that in the regs, and that's 61.23. So if you meet the criteria that are outlined in 6123C2, then you can use your driver's license to act as PIC in our Cessna aircraft as a sport pilot, exercising sport pilot privileges. You could also just use your driver's license as your quote medical if you're a private or a commercial pilot holder, certificate holder, but exercising sport pilot privileges. But what about if you're a student pilot? And here's where I noticed some odd language in the new regulations that we still don't have a clear answer to that I'm going to talk about here in a second. So we've identified a potential error in the wording that I hope FAA will address, but I'm going to illustrate to you here what the little gotcha is in the new regulation. So under 61.23 medical certificates, requirement and duration, it says under letter C, operations requiring either a medical certificate or a U.S. driver's license. So it's either or. So a person must hold and possess either a medical certificate issued under Part 67 of this chapter or a U.S. driver's license when exercising the privileges of a student pilot certificate while seeking sport pilot privileges in a light sport aircraft other than a glider or balloon. So that's what the regulation says right now. That's Sport Pilot 1.0. So note again, it says a student pilot certificate, which is a separate certificate from a private pilot certificate or a sport pilot certificate or a commercial. A student pilot certificate is its own thing that you have to have as a student pilot flying whatever. So the current regulation prior to October 22nd says you can use your driver's license if you're seeking sport pilot privileges in a light sport aircraft. Okay, so this is the revised version of that text that, unless the FAA edits this, which I hope they will go into effect on October 22nd. What the new regulation says is you have to have either a medical or a U.S. driver's license when exercising the privileges of a student pilot certificate while seeking sport pilot privileges in an aircraft meeting the performance limits and design requirements of 61.316, which is a brand new regulation under Sport Pilot 2.0. Okay, so they've eliminated the word light sport aircraft and changed it to an aircraft meeting the performance limits and design requirements, which, long story short, includes our Cessna aircraft and a bunch of other things. But here's the kicker as it relates to flight training. So what does, quote, seeking, and that's the key word here, what does seeking sport pilot privileges mean? Under Sport Pilot 1.0, it didn't really matter what certificate you were seeking or held already, because it was the light sport aircraft itself that determined that you didn't need a medical to fly it. Now, you could have a medical and exercise private pilot privileges in a light sport aircraft, but it was the light sport aircraft itself that ultimately said you do not have to have a medical to fly it. If you do, that's great, but you don't have to have one to fly this plane. But now that they've removed the light sport aircraft and changed it to an aircraft that meets the performance requirements, blah, 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 to include like our Cessna 150, 152, or 172, under Sport Pilot 2.0 now, how are we as flight school owners and instructors, how are we supposed to determine that a student pilot is seeking sport pilot privileges as opposed to private pilot privileges in our Cessna as a student pilot? Because remember, when you're a student pilot, you are seeking the privileges. You don't yet have them. So this is verbiage that applies to students only. A sport pilot can have a medical. They just don't need a medical, right? So as of today, there is no separate student pilot certificate for sport pilot seekers versus private pilot seekers. You're a student pilot, regardless of what you're seeking. And there's nothing in the regulations or the endorsements or anywhere where we as the instructor would say, okay, you, Johnny, student pilot, you are a sport pilot seeker. But Jane over here is a private pilot seeker, both hopping in to solo the same airplane. Do you see what I mean? So I emailed the Orlando FSDO, which is our Flight Standards District Office. This is our local FAA representatives in Orlando. And I also emailed the National Association of Flight Instructors on July 29th, and I'm still waiting a response from either of them. So quick update, I'm publishing this video here on August 17th, and on Friday the 15th, I also emailed the national contact for Mosaic, which you can see in this screenshot from the Federal Register. So I'll publish an update if I get a response from any of these folks. So I hope that other flight instructors out there have noticed the same thing, and I hope that the FSDOs around the country and the FAA is getting questions from other flight instructors about what exactly do you want us to do about this, and I hope we get an answer by October. Otherwise, I'm not quite sure what we're going to do yet, so this is a moving target. So just to clarify, if this regulation wording is left as is without any modification between now and October 22nd, it implies that a student pilot who claims to be seeking sport pilot privileges does not need a medical to solo my airplane, but a student pilot who claims to be seeking a private pilot certificate does need a medical. So I hope you can see the inherent conflict there. FAR 61.94. So we're still seeking clarification on this. So this says right now, a student pilot seeking a sport pilot certificate or a recreational pilot certificate. Now the recreational pilot certificate is a whole nother ball of wax. I've talked about that in previous videos. There's less than 100 people in the entire country currently that hold a recreational pilot certificate. So for all intents and purposes, you can ignore it. So if you're a student pilot seeking a sport pilot certificate, and you want to operate out of class Bravo, Charlie, or Delta, our student pilots right now flying our Cessna 150, 152, and 172, they don't need a separate endorsement, okay, that says you can operate in class Delta airspace. And if you're a flight instructor out there listening to this, you'll understand the nuance here. Okay, there's endorsements that say you have privileges, student pilot, to operate out of X, Y, and Z airport, either locally to do pattern work or to go on a cross country, blah, blah, blah. But there's nothing specifically that says you have permission to operate at a class Delta or even in class Charlie airspace. That's just assumed. The only thing you would need extra training and endorsement for would be for class Bravo, like to go to Orlando International or Miami International. So again, this is a bit tricky. If you're a student pilot going on your first solo at Craig Airport, which is class Delta, if you're seeking sport pilot privileges, you would need this separate endorsement, presumably, but if you are seeking a private pilot certificate, you wouldn't. So not quite sure how we're supposed to handle that.
Advisory Circular 61-65 is the primary resource used by flight instructors when issuing endorsements to pilots, including student pilots. The current version, as of August 9, 2025, is AC 61-65J, which was published on October 30, 2024. As you can see here, the current version does not include endorsements for student pilots who wish to fly in Class D or C airspace, unless they are seeking a sport pilot certificate.
So the next thing I want to cover is health and wellness education for all pilots. Now, one of my beefs with the whole third class medical thing and sport pilots not needing medical is that there's lots of emphasis placed on the private pilot level and those obtaining a third class medical, where you have to fill out this health questionnaire, basically giving your life story about all your doctor's visits and anything that's wrong with you. You have to go to a physician that's FAA approved to get your medical. There's also a loophole that's been out there for a couple of years now called Basic Med, which isn't super relevant to what I'm talking about today, but that's an alternative to the third class medical for some folks. It's called Basic Med. You can look it up. But for folks that go through this process, I would hope that at least through filling out the application for their certificate, they would have thought through, oh yeah, I did have some surgery, or I did have this, or I did have that. So don't get me wrong. I don't think that the third class medical process has any sort of substantial effect on aviation safety. I truly don't. I'm a firm believer that they should just eliminate the third class medical for all pilots, because I think the holding of the certificate is totally meaningless. But there is some value in the education and the thought process required in the application. And that's what I would hope to address here, because now if you are seeking sport pilot privileges and you don't even have to go there as far as the third class medical goes, you just have to say, okay, yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with me, let's go fly. I do think it would be beneficial to all pilots, regardless of whether or not you're getting a medical or seeking sport pilot privileges or whatever, to have some additional educational materials on health and wellness. Now, the FAA really glosses over this in the training manuals, and if you are a pilot and you fly an aircraft at a flight school with some decent safety standards, you may have heard of the I'm Safe checklist. The FAA has various mnemonics for pilot self-assessment of their own health. But I've seen lots of cases where pilots have never heard of this. They really don't think about it a whole lot, and that's kind of troubling to me. So what we'd like to do is, quote, level the playing field for all pilots, sport pilots, private pilots, whoever, and add some additional health and wellness education into our flight training programs now that it is going to be possible and legal in certain situations for someone to fly our airplanes here at Holladay Aviation without ever touching that process. So this training will be based on the currently available FAA materials. I don't know if Sporties and the like plan on introducing any of this material on their own. I think that would be great if they did, but just to head this off at the pass, we're going to put together a little package and include this in our training materials. So topics may include, how do we know that we're fit to fly? Again, alluding to the I'm safe checklist that you may have heard of if you're a pilot. So the I stands for illness, the M stands for medication, the S stands for stress, alcohol, fatigue, and E, I like to think, stands for eating, to make sure that we're nourished and hydrated. We want to talk about mental health. This has actually come into the forefront, which I think is a good thing in the pilot community recently. There's a non-for-profit organization that specializes in pilot mental health, so I'd like to let our folks know that this organization exists and that these resources exist for pilots that may be going through something that could affect their performance when they're flying. Talk a little bit about nutrition and hydration. We've seen this happen at the flight school where a pilot may have been rushing to get to the lesson and skipped breakfast and got a little woozy in the cockpit, and then we ask them after the fact, are you doing okay? And then we find out that they, skipped a meal. So I think a lot of times, unless you kind of put it out there and remind folks of this, they could get themselves into a little bit of a pickle. So I'd like to remind folks of the importance of that. And exercise. So I don't think any of these things are bad for anybody to review. And I think, personal wellness is certainly important for pilots. So this is something that we plan to cover as we introduce sport pilots into the fold. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the training requirements and how the FAA under Sport Pilot 2.0 is not changing, as far as I could tell, the training requirements, the basic training requirements for sport pilots, other than these additional requirements like if you want night privileges or you want to fly a complex airplane. But the basic requirements to earn the certificate are not changing at all, as far as I could tell. So those requirements to date, and presumably in the future, are, again, you don't need a medical. You can operate with your driver's license. You only need a minimum of 20 hours of flight time as opposed to the 40 hours for the private. You only need 5 hours of solo flight time as opposed to 10 hours for a private. You don't need any instrument training for a sport pilot certificate. And this is one of my personal beefs with the rule that I've addressed in previous YouTube videos. It's minimal training required other than for the student pilot seeking the sport pilot privileges while they were logging their solo flight time in cross countries. You would need just this minimal amount of instrument training to qualify for student pilot solo cross country privileges, but there's no time requirement there. It just says you have to have received training in X, Y, and Z things, but it doesn't say how long you can spend or you have to spend doing it. But to earn a private pilot certificate, there is a minimum, and that's 3 hours. For a sport pilot, again, you don't have to have any night training, and for a private pilot, you have to have 3 hours of night training, which includes takeoffs and landings in the traffic pattern as well as a cross country. So what we are proposing here at Holladay Aviation is to align the sport pilot training with the private pilot in a reasonable way. As you'll see in some of my other videos and here, the national average, and this is data coming straight from the horse's mouth, this is from FAA, the national average to earn a sport pilot certificate to date is about 80 hours. And the national average to earn a private pilot certificate is 100. So last time I checked, 80 was not half of 100. The solo flight time required for sport pilot, we're okay leaving that the way it is at 5 hours. And the private pilot, you have to have a minimum of 10 hours of solo flight time to qualify. Here's where we disagree with the FAA, and we're going to level the playing field because we think it makes sense practically and from a safety standpoint. We do plan to provide our sport pilot applicants with the same instrument training that private pilots get because they are flying the same airplane and basically doing the same thing, and in our opinion have the same likelihood of getting themselves into a low visibility emergency as their private pilot colleagues So we feel that they should have the same training in that regard. Night training, we don't feel it's super necessary for a sport pilot, since none is required by the FAA to have the 3 hours necessarily for that the private pilot has. But we will do a minimum of 1 hour of flight training, and that would include 10 takeoffs and landings in the traffic pattern at Craig. The idea here is, look guys, if you are a sport pilot flying my airplane on a cross country, let's say you take your wife up to St. Simon's for dinner, and you guys come back and it's starting to get a little late because there was a wait getting your dinner tab, and now the sun is setting and you're coming back to Craig. I would really like for you to have had some experience landing when it's dark, because as great as you plan, sometimes it just happens. And so I think it's kind of ridiculous that a sport pilot candidate shouldn't at least have been exposed to this during their training with an instructor. And then yes, if you actually want the privilege of flying at night intentionally, you can get that additional training and you can go fly at night as PIC, the same as your private pilot colleagues. But we do feel that for safety reasons, it's prudent to at least, like I said, introduce this during the training curriculum. So we will include this as part of our sport pilot curriculum. So now let's talk about the cost savings of a sport pilot versus a private pilot at Holladay Aviation. Now, various industry groups, members of the FAA, continue to claim that the sport pilot certificate is a, quote, half-price pilot certificate compared to the private. And again, I've got the data from the FAA. That is simply not true. And let's just look at the reality of the situation here at Craig. So all Holladay Aviation student and renter pilots are going to be flying the same planes. So no matter what certificate you are seeking with us up through flight instructor, frankly, you have access to the same airplanes. It's the Cessna 150s, the 152, and the 3 172s. So you folks are getting the same training to the same safety standards. So therefore, we don't anticipate any significant time or cost savings for sport pilot applicants versus private pilot applicants at Holladay Aviation here at Craig. All of our sport pilot applicants will receive training and the requisite endorsements for Class Delta and Charlie airspace due to the fact that we're based at Class Delta Airport and our proximity to Jacksonville International. Again, it simply doesn't make any sense to do otherwise for us. Now, if you're flying at a non-towered airport out in the middle of nowhere, this may not be a big issue for you, but here in the Jacksonville metro area, it's kind of a big deal. I'm going to touch upon one of our key cornerstone safety protocols, AQP for GA. This applies to sport pilots as well as private pilots. And when you get down to it, if you compare the sport pilot practical test standards with the private pilot airman certification standards, they are nearly identical. A check ride for a sport pilot and a private pilot is going to take just as long. You're basically doing the same things. There are some rather odd and arbitrary differences in the test standards for the sport pilot versus the private pilot and the minimum altitudes at which some of the maneuvers must be conducted. But at the end of the day, it's basically the same check ride that you're preparing for. So it doesn't make any sense to believe or to state that it's going to take you any less time to prepare for that check ride, one versus the other. So here's the page on our website, AQP for General Aviation. We've kind of rebranded it a bit to make folks warm up to it a bit more, make it seem a little less scary. The aviator's quest for perfection. So this is sort of our mantra that no matter what you're flying, whether it's a Cessna 150 or a Learjet or an Airbus for the airlines, you have to have some minimum safety standards and protocols that you abide by in order to be a safe pilot. And so again, that would apply to sport pilots as well. So now if we drill down and actually look at what are the real potential cost savings for a sport pilot versus a private pilot at Holladay Aviation. So sport pilot applicants, again, will only be required to complete 5 hours of solo flight time instead of the 10 hours required. Now, you may end up actually flying more. The delay between any applicant for any certificate completing their training and getting endorsed by the instructor and submitting their application to the FAA and the IACA website, these examiners are backed up 6 to 8 weeks. So any applicant for any certificate or rating is going to spend that time practicing. Now, if you are a solo student pilot, you very well may end up, by the time you take your check ride, with a bit more than 5 hours or the 10 hours that's required. But again, just to kind of keep apples and apples here, for comparison purposes, one can say that the sport pilot applicant only needs half of the required solo time. So if you factor that out in our System 172, that's going to be a savings of about $900. Sport pilot applicants with us will only be required to complete one night flight. We generally can accomplish the night training requirements for the private pilot applicant in 2 flights. So we can sufficiently expose a sport pilot applicant to night flying practices and challenges in just 1 session. So again, if you calculate that out, a 2.5-hour lesson, etc., that's going to be about a $380 lesson charge that you'd only need 1 of instead of 2. So if you add those 2 things together, again, you can anticipate that the savings for a sport pilot versus a private pilot certificate with us at Holladay Aviation is going to be about $1,300. Now, that's not a small amount of money, but again, if you consider all of the what ifs, that $1,280 may easily go away. And again, if you want the night training, to get the endorsement as a sport pilot, we would do the cross-country training with you prior to giving you that endorsement, because presumably you want that night endorsement, not so you can just go bomb around in the pattern at Craig, but so you can go somewhere and come back at night. So again, prudence would dictate that we do that cross-country training as well, just the same as we would do for a private pilot applicant. Some final considerations for sport pilots. Some Jacksonville area DPEs, or designated pilot examiners, are unable or unwilling to conduct practical tests in the Cessna 150 due to weight and balance restrictions. So there used to be an examiner here in Jacksonville who weighed a little more than me. He has since retired and moved, and now the fine gentlemen that perform the exams in the Jacksonville area weigh significantly more than I do, which means that we have some issues fitting them and a mature male applicant into a Cessna 150. So most of our private pilot applicants now are eventually transitioning to the Cessna 172 to take their test. So if you're thinking that, oh, as a sport pilot, 2-seat airplane, I can do all of my training and my check ride in the Cessna 150, it may not be possible. So that's something to consider. That extra cost associated with flying the larger aircraft just because you have to in order to get the test done. If you are considering earning a sport pilot certificate and then upgrading to a private pilot certificate sometime down the road, remember that you'll have to take another knowledge and another practical test at a cost of about $1,500 in test fees, plus an additional 3+ hours of training to prepare for that other practical test, and then keep flying in the gap between your sign-off and the new test. So at the end of the day, if you're getting a sport pilot certificate to save money, but you ultimately want to get a private pilot certificate, the reality is you're not saving yourself any money. You're just delaying the inevitable, and you might as well just go for the private pilot certificate. The other thing, which is still an unknown, is the availability and cost of insurance coverage for sport pilots that are flying our aircraft. We still don't know exactly how that's going to play out. We've talked to our insurance carrier, and we kind of got the impression from them that there might not be any rate increases, but our policy renews in October. This is just coincident with the issuance of the new rule. So we really just don't know yet if there's going to be any changes to the insurance, and if the insurance goes up, we may have to pass that along to the customer. What does Sport Pilot 2.0 mean for renters? You can rent Holladay Aviation aircraft while exercising Sport Pilot privileges with a valid driver's license in lieu of an FAA medical certificate. And a big question that's come up in a lot of the forums online since the announcement at AirVenture of Mosaic is, so is a Cessna 172 now considered a light sport aircraft? The answer is no. So what's changed is who can fly that airplane under what terms, but the airplane itself is still still has the same airworthiness certificate. It still has to be maintained under the same rules, so the airplane itself isn't changing. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the session, there are additional rules associated with Mosaic pertaining to the manufacture of new light sport aircraft. But for existing light sport aircraft or airplanes that hold a regular certificate like our Cessna 172, they are not changing in any way.
So that's all the news for now. Make sure you subscribe to our channel so you'll be notified when I publish more information as it becomes available. Thanks for watching.